The world is still in the early hours of dawn, blanketed in a soft layer of freshly fallen snow. The Montana wilderness is a picture of tranquility, the crisp air carrying the scent of pine and the distant echo of a howling wolf. The towering evergreens stand watch over a frozen landscape, their limbs heavy with frost. A thin veil of morning mist hovers over the valley, swirling gently in the icy breeze. It is the kind of morning that invites solitude and reflection, a peaceful reprieve from the relentless march of time. Then, from the distance, the silence is shattered. A low rumble begins to rise, deep and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of an unstoppable beast. It builds into a deafening roar, the ground trembling beneath its approach. A train, massive, unyielding, thunders down the tracks, its powerful engine cutting through the wilderness like a blade through silk. The steel wheels screech as they bite into the rails, sending sparks into the cold air. The metal behemoth charges forward, oblivious to anything in its path, its presence a stark contrast to the untouched serenity of nature. Near the edge of the tracks, a tragedy is unfolding. A grizzly bear, massive, once mighty, lies chained to the frozen steel. Her fur, dusted with frost and smeared with dirt, ripples as she shifts weakly, the great muscles beneath her frame worn and battered. Her eyes, usually sharp and fierce, are dulled with exhaustion and pain. The remnants of her struggles are evident in the blood-streaked snow where her claws have torn at the ground in desperation. She is trapped, the heavy iron shackles digging into her thick limbs, rendering her powerless. Aurora, as she will later come to be known, has 3 cubs. They are small, fragile things, bundled close to their mother's heaving side, their fur fluffed against the cold. They tremble in confusion, their wide eyes darting between the looming threat of the train and the mother who has always protected them. The urgency of the moment is lost on them. They know only the warmth of her body, the steady heartbeat that has been their refuge since birth. But that heartbeat is faltering now. Aurora exhales, a slow, labored breath that curls into the frigid air. The fight has drained from her body. She knows what is coming. With the last remnants of her strength, she nuzzles each of her cubs, lingering just long enough for them to feel her warmth, to hear the soft rumble of her affection one final time. Then, with a final sigh, she closes her eyes. A moment later, she stops struggling, but someone is watching. From the ridge above, Ethan Carter's hands tighten around his camera lens. He has spent years capturing the raw, untamed beauty of the wilderness, its majesty, its brutality. But this is something else. His pulse spikes as he adjusts the focus, bringing the scene into sharper relief. The train, the bear, the chains, the cubs, and then realization strikes him like a physical blow. This is no accident. The chains glisten against the frost, too deliberate, too precise to be the work of nature. Someone has done this. Someone has bound this magnificent creature to the tracks and left her to die. A surge of rage courses through Ethan's veins, but there is no time for anger. The train is closing in. He moves without thinking, his boots skidding over the loose rock as he races down the embankment. Snow and ice threaten to steal his footing, but he pushes forward, reckless, desperate. He barely registers the branches that lash at his face, the sting of the wind against his exposed skin. He has seconds. Reaching the tracks, he drops to his knees, his fingers instantly going numb as they fumble with the frozen chains. He pulls, tugs, but the iron holds fast. The train's whistle screams through the valley, a warning, a death knell. The ground vibrates beneath him, sending panic through his chest. Then something remarkable happens. Aurora moves. She doesn't fight him. She doesn't lash out. Instead, she shifts, just enough to allow him better access to the chains, as if she understands, as if she is helping him. Their eyes meet for the briefest of moments, his filled with determination, hers with something almost like trust. He redoubles his efforts. The metal is stiff with ice, biting into his skin, but he doesn't stop. The train is almost upon them now, the rails humming with its unstoppable force. One last pull, The chains give way. Ethan doesn't hesitate. He scoops up 2 of the cubs in his arms, his body screaming in protest as he bolts from the tracks. Aurora, freed at last, snatches the last cub in her jaws and lunges. Behind them, the train barrels past. The wind of its passing rips through the clearing, a force so powerful that it sends snow flying in a swirling storm. The roar is deafening, drowning out every other sound as it streaks through the valley, oblivious to the lives it nearly claimed. And then, just as quickly as it came, the train is gone. The silence returns, thick and heavy, settling over the forest like a final exhale. Ethan lies in the snow, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The cubs squirm against his chest, warm and alive. He looks up and finds Aurora standing just feet away, her massive frame silhouetted against the dawn. She watches him, her golden eyes reflecting something he can't quite name. Then, without a sound, she turns and disappears into the trees, her cubs following close behind. Ethan remains where he is, his heart pounding, his mind reeling. He should feel relief, triumph. But instead, a single haunting question lingers in the back of his mind. Who did this? And why? The adrenaline from the rescue still coursed through Ethan Carter's veins as he stood in the snow, watching the last flicker of Aurora's shadow disappear into the forest with her cubs. He should have felt relief. He had saved them. But instead, a slow, burning fury began to take root in his chest. Someone had done this. Someone had deliberately chained Aurora and her cubs to those tracks, sentencing them to a brutal, senseless death. The metal had been wrapped too tightly, too methodically. It hadn't been a freak accident. This was planned. And Ethan had no doubt that whoever had done it hadn't expected anyone to be watching. Then there were the scars. He had seen them when he cut through the chains, long, jagged marks beneath her fur, some older than others, all speaking of prolonged suffering. This wasn't the first time Aurora had been restrained, and it sure as hell wasn't the first time she had been hurt. Someone had held her captive for weeks, maybe months. Someone had used her, beaten her, broken her spirit until she had nothing left to fight with. And then, when she was no longer useful, they had left her to die. Ethan clenched his fists, his breath sharp and cold in the night air. He wasn't going to let this go. He had dedicated his life to capturing the raw beauty of the wild, to telling stories of resilience and survival. But this was something else. This was cruelty. And he would find whoever was behind it. He turned away from the tracks and pulled out his phone, his fingers still stiff from the cold. He knew one person who could help him dig into this. His son, Logan. Ethan pressed the call button and listened as the line rang. Once. Twice. "Dad?" Logan's voice came through, groggy, uncertain. "Logan, I need you to do something for me," Ethan said, his voice sharper than he intended. "I just found a bear. She was chained to the train tracks. This wasn't an accident. Someone did this on purpose." Silence. Ethan's gut tightened. "Logan? I don't know, Dad." His son's voice was quieter now, edged with something Ethan couldn't quite place. That's crazy. Who would do something like that?" "You tell me." Ethan narrowed his eyes. Logan's hesitation wasn't just shock. It was something deeper, something heavier. There was another long pause. I gotta go," Logan said suddenly. "I'll call you later." Then the line went dead. Ethan lowered the phone slowly. His pulse had steadied, but his mind was now racing in another direction. Logan knew something. That much was clear. But what? And why was he afraid to say it? Ethan knew he couldn't wait for answers. He had to find Aurora and her cubs before her wounds worsened. He tracked them easily enough. Her heavy footprints led away from the tracks and down toward a familiar spot near the creek on his property. He had designated the area as an unofficial wildlife sanctuary, a place where injured animals could recover before returning to the wild. Sure enough, Aurora had retreated into a cave nestled in the hillside, her cubs pressed close to her side. She was weak, her massive body rising and falling in shallow breaths. But she was still watching, still aware. Ethan moved carefully, murmuring softly as he prepared the sedative. "Easy, girl. I'm here to help." Aurora didn't resist. She was too exhausted. As the tranquilizer took effect, Ethan stepped closer, kneeling beside her to examine her injuries. What he found made his stomach turn. Deep gashes, some still raw, others barely healed. The scars of a bear that had been held captive, restrained, beaten. Her claws had been worn down unnaturally, as if she had spent weeks trying to break free from something. And that's when he knew. This wasn't just some cruel prank. Aurora had been held somewhere, long enough for her wounds to heal, long enough for her to learn that escape was impossible. Someone had owned her, someone had used her, and someone had tried to erase their mistake by leaving her for dead. The crunch of footsteps in the snow pulled Ethan from his thoughts. He turned to see Logan approaching, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, his shoulders tense. His son's face was pale, his expression twisted with something between guilt and fear. "Logan," Ethan said, standing up. "Talk to me." Logan swallowed hard. His breath came out in uneven bursts like he was trying to hold something in. Finally, he spoke. "It was Ryan," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And Ella, and Jordan. They found the bears weeks ago, near Ryan's uncle's cabin. They thought it was an opportunity." Ethan's jaw clenched. Opportunity for what? They wanted to train them, use them, make money off them somehow, like those roadside zoos, you know? Logan's eyes darted to the sedated Aurora. But she wouldn't cooperate. She fought back. Ethan exhaled sharply. Of course she had. Ryan's uncle, Warren, said they couldn't keep her if she wouldn't behave. Said she was a liability. So, Logan's voice cracked. So he got rid of her, chained her to the tracks and left her there. Ethan's stomach turned. "And you knew about this?" Logan's gaze dropped to the snow. "I tried to stop them," he whispered. "I swear I did. But Ryan, he blackmailed me." Ethan's breath caught. "Blackmailed you how?" A long silence stretched between them. Then finally Logan said, "He knows what I did. The night Mom died." Ethan froze. The night his wife had passed had been one of the worst nights of their lives. But now something new, something dark, was surfacing. "I stole medication," Logan admitted, "from the hospital. I thought I could help her. I thought if I gave her enough painkillers, she'd stop hurting." He squeezed his eyes shut. But it didn't work. She still died. And Ryan found out. He's been holding it over me ever since. Ethan took a step forward. "Son," Logan's shoulders shook. "I was scared, Dad. I was scared that if you found out, you'd never look at me the same way again." Ethan felt a deep ache in his chest. He placed a firm hand on Logan's shoulder. "Listen to me," he said. "What happened that night, that wasn't your fault. And this is your chance to do the right thing." Logan looked up, his eyes brimming with uncertainty. "You think it's not too late?" Ethan squeezed his shoulder. "It's never too late." Together they gathered the evidence, photographs, chain fragments, Aurora's wounds, and took everything to the authorities. Ethan made the call. Logan gave his statement. Ryan and his uncle wouldn't get away with this. As Ethan watched his son stand tall, no longer weighed down by guilt and fear, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about saving Aurora. It was about saving Logan, too. The cold Montana wind howled through the trees as Ethan Carter stood at the edge of the sheriff's station, watching the sky bleed into the deep purples and blues of twilight. It had been a long day, one of revelations, of hard truths, and of choices that could not be undone. But now, the wheels of justice had begun to turn. Sheriff Natalie Rhodes was a woman who did not tolerate cruelty. Not to people, not to animals, not to the land she had sworn to protect. With a reputation for being relentless, she wasted no time launching a full-scale investigation. Alongside her was Greg Mathis, a federal wildlife crimes investigator, whose experience in tracking down poachers and traffickers made him the perfect ally in what was quickly unraveling into something much bigger than anyone had expected. The evidence piled up fast. When officers raided Warren's remote hunting cabin, they found more than just empty cages and discarded chains. They uncovered a chilling pattern: documents, hidden ledgers, and surveillance footage dating back years, all pointing to a gruesome operation. Warren hadn't just tried to profit from Aurora and her cubs. He had been running an illegal wildlife trafficking ring for years, selling off captured animals to the highest bidder. Bears, wolves, mountain lions, anything he could trap, he found a way to monetize. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Logan, Ella, and Jordan came forward with their testimonies, finally exposing Ryan and Warren for what they had done. Ella's hands trembled as she recounted how they had initially thought it was just a game, a stupid thrill until things spiraled out of control. Jordan, usually the cocky one, could barely look up from the floor as he admitted that he had known it was wrong, but had been too afraid to challenge Ryan. But Logan's testimony was the most damning. His voice was steady, but his hands clenched into fists as he described what had happened the night Warren decided Aurora was too much of a liability. How Ryan had boasted that no one would care about one dumb bear. How Logan had wanted to stop it but had been too scared, too trapped in his own guilt. How he had stayed silent for far too long. The confessions sealed their fate. The town of Fairbanks had never seen anything like it. When the police finally arrived at Warren's property, they didn't come quietly. Sirens cut through the evening air, flashing lights casting long shadows over the frozen dirt road leading to his cabin. Warren stepped onto his porch, his eyes cold, unreadable, as the officers closed in. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, but there was no bravado in his voice now. Just the slow, creeping realization that he was caught. "You people got nothing but the word of a bunch of scared kids." Sheriff Rhodes didn't flinch. "We have more than that," she said, holding up a folder thick with evidence. "We have your ledgers, your videos, your buyers. It's over, Warren." Ryan, on the other hand, didn't have his uncle's steel. When the officers dragged him out of his truck, his bravado cracked, replaced by sheer panic. "This is a mistake. I didn't do anything." But the words meant nothing now. The cuffs clicked shut, and just like that, the men who had inflicted so much cruelty were taken away. The town was stunned. Some had suspected Warren had always been up to something shady, but no one had imagined this level of depravity. Parents whispered about Ryan, about how he had always been trouble but had never faced real consequences. Until now. Justice had finally caught up with them. But for Ethan and Logan, the hardest part was yet to come. The night was still, the quiet settling over the Carter home like a heavy weight. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Ethan sat across from his son, his gaze steady but gentle. He knew Logan had more to say. He could see it in the way his son's shoulders sagged, in the way his fingers fidgeted against his knee. And finally, Logan spoke. "I need to tell you the whole truth, Dad." His voice was raw, edged with something that had been festering for too long. Ethan nodded, waiting. "The night Mom died." Logan took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I stole medication from the hospital pharmacy." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of guilt. "I thought if I could just get enough painkillers, maybe she'd hurt less. Maybe she'd make it through the night." Ethan's heart clenched. He had known his son had struggled that night. Grief could break anyone. But he hadn't known this. "I took the pills, but it didn't matter," Logan continued, his voice breaking. "She still died. And then I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I was scared of what you'd think of me. I was scared the hospital would find out and press charges." Ethan reached for his son's hand, but Logan pulled away, shaking his head. "Ryan was there," he admitted, his expression crumbling. "He found me. He saw everything. And instead of turning me in, he helped me cover it up. He said if I ever crossed him, he'd tell everyone what I did. Logan swallowed hard. So I kept quiet about everything. About the bears, about Warren, about all of it. Because I was afraid. Silence hung between them. Ethan could feel the years of pain in his son's words. The guilt that had shaped him, haunted him. And in that moment, he saw Logan, not as a boy who had made mistakes, but as a boy who had been drowning. Drowning in grief, in fear, in the weight of his own conscience. Ethan stood and moved toward his son, placing his hands on Logan's shoulders. "Logan," he said firmly, "you were just a kid. You were trying to save your mother. That doesn't make you a bad person." Logan shook his head, eyes shining. But nothing," Ethan cut in. "What matters is what you do now. You told the truth. You stood up and did the right thing when it counted. That's what defines you, not your mistakes." Logan finally looked up, searching his father's face as if trying to find the lie in his words. But there wasn't one. For the first time in years, Logan let out a breath that didn't feel like it was crushing him. Ethan pulled him into a tight embrace, feeling the tension in his son's body finally begin to ease. "You're my son," he murmured, "and I will always be proud of you." The next morning, as the sun rose over the Montana wilderness, the world felt different, lighter. Warren and Ryan were behind bars, facing a long list of charges. Logan was free of the secret that had chained him for years. And out in the wild, Aurora and her cubs roamed once more, no longer bound by chains. Justice had been served, but more than that, redemption had begun. The cold Montana air carried the scent of pine and damp earth as Logan Carter adjusted his gloves, the weight of the shovel firm in his hands. He glanced toward the enclosure where Aurora and her cubs roamed, now stronger than they had been when he first saw them chained to the railroad tracks. It had been weeks since that night, since the truth had unraveled and the weight of his choices had crashed down around him. Weeks since Ryan and Warren had been arrested, since Logan had finally come clean. The guilt still sat heavy in his chest, but it wasn't suffocating him anymore. He was here to make things right. As part of their sentence, Logan, Ella, and Jordan had been ordered to complete community service at Ethan's wildlife sanctuary. Sheriff Rhodes had seen the value in education over punishment, and Ethan had agreed, if they wanted to truly atone, they needed to face what they had done head-on. For Logan, that meant spending every morning and afternoon under the watchful eyes of the mother bear he had once condemned to death. Aurora didn't trust them at first. She was a wild animal after all, and her survival had been carved from lessons in cruelty. When they approached her enclosure, she would lift her massive head, her golden eyes sharp and unreadable. Her cubs, on the other hand, were curious but cautious, watching as the teens cleaned, built enrichment tools, and learned everything they could about bear rehabilitation. It was slow work. Jordan, once the loudest and cockiest among them, was quieter now, more thoughtful. He spent his time repairing the damage done to Aurora's enclosure, hammering nails into sturdy new platforms and arranging logs for climbing. Ella had thrown herself into research, documenting everything from Aurora's diet to the best methods for reintroducing captive bears into the wild. She kept careful notes, organizing them into a thick binder she carried everywhere. And Logan just wanted to earn her trust. At first he worked in silence, keeping his distance. But over time, Aurora began to change. Her stiff posture relaxed. Her ears, once always pinned back, flicked forward with curiosity. The real turning point came one afternoon when Logan crouched down near the fence, watching the cubs wrestle. To his surprise, Aurora didn't tense. She just watched him. A moment passed, then another. And then, to his utter shock, she exhaled a long, slow breath and turned away as if accepting his presence. For Logan, it felt like absolution. It wasn't just the sanctuary that was changing. It was the whole town. Sheriff Rhodes had launched a new initiative focused on wildlife protection, ensuring that what had happened to Aurora would never happen again. New laws were introduced, harsher penalties enforced. The community, shaken by the truth of what Warren had been doing for years, rallied behind Ethan's sanctuary. Donations poured in, bags of feed, medical supplies, even lumber for new enclosures. Schools arranged field trips to teach children about the importance of conservation. Hunters and ranchers, once wary of Ethan's work, started listening. Ethan had spent years fighting to get people to care. Now, they finally did. After weeks of steady recovery, Aurora and her cubs were ready to return to the wild. The moment Ethan had been working toward was finally here. But it wasn't just Ethan who had prepared for this. Logan, Ella, and Jordan had spent days organizing a farewell ceremony. One final act of gratitude, of atonement, before the bears left for good. Ella compiló su investigación en un archivo detallado, asegurando que futuras rescates tendrían un mapa para el éxito. She had spent nights reading through scientific papers, consulting with wildlife experts, and documenting everything she had learned about Aurora's rehabilitation. Jordan, whose hands had once built enclosures to trap bears, now used them to create something different, a climbing structure at the release site made from thick logs and stones, something for the cubs to explore as they adjusted to their new world. And Logan did the only thing he could. He sketches. On a large canvas, he captured the story of Aurora's journey. The heavy chains around her neck, the moment of rescue, the weeks of healing, and finally, the future. Aurora standing tall and strong, her cubs at her side, free. When Ethan saw it, he simply nodded, his eyes filled with something Logan had never seen before: pride. The morning of Aurora's release was crisp and golden, the sky stretching endlessly above the mountains. The sanctuary had never felt so still, so reverent. Ethan stood by the trailer as the door creaked open. Aurora hesitated for only a second before stepping forward, her muscles rippling beneath her thick coat. Her cubs followed closely, their small paws pressing into the soft dirt. Logan held his breath. Then, as if sensing the weight of the moment, the smallest cub paused at the edge of the clearing. The others moved ahead, disappearing into the trees, but she lingered. She turned her head, and for the briefest of moments her dark eyes locked onto Logan's. Time slowed. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly. She was a bear, wild, instinct-driven, free. But in her gaze, there was something Logan couldn't quite explain. Understanding, maybe. Or perhaps something simpler. Forgiveness. Then, with a small huff, the cub turned and bounded after her family. And just like that, they were gone. Logan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ethan clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, kid." Logan watched the trees where the bears had disappeared. He had spent so long carrying the weight of his mistakes, convinced that nothing could undo them. But today, for the first time, he didn't feel like the same person he had been before. Today he felt lighter. He turned to Ethan and nodded. "I think I'm ready to start over." Ethan smiled. "So do I." The Montana wilderness had always been vast, wild, and untamed. But now, standing at the edge of the sanctuary, Logan Carter saw it differently. Not as a place of fear, not as a place of regret, but as a place of redemption. The sanctuary had changed since that fateful night on the railroad tracks. What had once been a modest refuge for injured wildlife was now expanding, growing into something more, a true haven. Donations from the community had poured in, allowing Ethan to build new enclosures, expand veterinary care, and create dedicated rehabilitation areas. And at the heart of it all were 3 teenagers who had once been part of the problem, now determined to be part of the solution. Logan, Ella, and Jordan had once stood on the wrong side of history, complicit in a crime they could never erase. But they had chosen a different path. They worked tirelessly to undo the damage, learning from Ethan, from the land, and from the animals they had once harmed. Every morning, Jordan hammered away at new structures, repairing and improving the sanctuary with a focus and dedication that no one had ever seen in him before. He was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. His work no longer about making up for mistakes, but about doing something that mattered. Ella had become the sanctuary's resident expert, spending late nights studying wildlife rehabilitation, consulting experts, and designing better ways to care for injured animals. Her research had already saved 2 orphaned fox kits and a wounded owl. And Logan had found something he never expected: purpose. He spent his days tracking, sketching, and documenting the stories of the animals that came through the sanctuary. He was no longer haunted by the past. Instead, he used it to fuel his commitment, to tell stories that made people care. Aurora had taught him that. One evening, long after the last visitors had left and the sanctuary had settled into a peaceful quiet, Logan sat outside with his sketchbook resting on his lap. The moon cast a soft glow over the land, and in the distance the sound of rustling leaves and distant howls filled the air. He was working on one final sketch, the last portrait of Aurora. Unlike the ones before, this was not a drawing of her in chains. It was not a moment of suffering or captivity. This was Aurora as she was meant to be: wild, free, strong. Ethan sat beside him, silent for a long time before finally speaking. "You've changed," he said. Logan set down his pencil and looked at his father. "I had to." Ethan nodded. "You chose to." There had been a time when Logan thought the past would always define him, that no matter what he did, he would always be the scared, reckless kid who had made a terrible mistake. But now, sitting here under the vast Montana sky, he realized something. Aurora hadn't just been a victim. She had been a survivor. And so was he. The next day, before leaving the release site for good, Logan knelt by the old feeding station, securing a weatherproof box into the ground. Inside it, he carefully placed his sketches, the story of Aurora, her cubs, and the journey they had all taken. "So others will know her story," he murmured, pressing the lid shut. He didn't want people to forget, not just about Aurora, but about the choices that led to her suffering, and the choices that saved her. As they drove away from the release site, the valley stretched out before them, golden in the morning light. The mountains stood tall in the distance, timeless and unmoving. Then, Ethan slowed the truck. "Look," he said. Logan followed his gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. Aurora. She stood silhouetted against the ridge, her massive form outlined against the dawn. Her cubs huddled close at her side, but her eyes were locked on them, watching, waiting. The deep sound she let out wasn't a growl, it wasn't a roar, it was something else entirely. A farewell, a warning, or perhaps a blessing. Logan felt something tighten in his chest, but it wasn't sadness. It was gratitude for everything she had endured, for everything she had taught him, for everything she had survived. As Aurora turned and disappeared into the wilderness, Ethan looked over at Logan. "This isn't an ending," he said quietly. Logan watched the last traces of the bear vanish into the trees, then turned back toward the open road ahead. "No," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's just the beginning."